Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with reference recordings. And today we are talking about Beethoven piano concertos. This is a very interesting topic. Piano concertos cycles, mind you. There may be other reference recordings for individual concertos. And yes, there are some, and we'll get to those in due course. But for complete sets, well, here we go again. The reference is Leon Fleisher and George Szell. Yeah, and I already see you guys saying, oh God, there goes Hurwitz again talking about George Szell. It's always George Szell in Cleveland, and he's American orchestras, and he's American because he's doing American things Americanishly, and oh my God, and it's... Look, here's the bottom line. The reason Szell's name comes up as often as it does is because when it comes to the basic German repertoire, nobody did it better. I mean, he was just amazing, particularly in this period, the 1950s and 60s, when most of what we now call the reference recordings were made. This doesn't mean there aren't other fabulous recordings of the Beethoven piano concertos or that this is the best set ever. It doesn't. It just means it was the reference versions, the one that everybody said had excellence, consistency, marketing penetration. I mean, we go through these criteria with virtually every talk because the comments that I get betray, very little understanding of what a reference recording is. And then, of course, if they do understand, they say, well, who cares? Well, we care because they're useful. They're useful and interesting, and they're mostly wonderful performances, of course, too. But the point I want to make about this particular set is that it just seems that it had very little competition as a set. I mean, as an entity. It's kind of interesting. There were other Beethoven piano concerto cycles in stereo in the late 50s and early 60s. There were. I mean, we had Claudio Arrau's first series on EMI with who was it? Alceo Galliera, I think, was the conductor. Those, it seems to me, didn't have the distribution, perhaps, that they should have. Klemperer did them with Barenboim. Those were considered a little bit eccentric, a little bit different. Barenboim was, kind of young and untested, comparatively speaking, and Klemperer was Klemperer. It's always been kind of a controversial set. I happen to think it's marvelous, but that's me. And then, of course, there was Wilhelm Kempff with Ferdinand Leitner. And the problem with that set was it's very interesting. Kempff was never really a concerto pianist. There was something about his art that was intimate, that didn't respond to sort of the bigger stage of the concerto world. Not that he didn't do excellent Beethoven piano concerti. He did. I mean, he did nice ones. They're lovely. But Leitner was never anything special. And it just seems that was Deutsche Grammophon, we forget, was not in the late 50s and early 60s the international force it later became. And this seemed to be a product that was made a little bit more for the domestic market. Let's put it that way. It never had the kind of I don't know how to describe it. It just was not a big deal for some reason. I mean, this is all very impressionistic because I'm only going by, first of all, what I know my colleagues in the business, fellow critics, thought, and what was written at the time, and what I've done, because I've done a lot of research and reading about these things, and when they came out and what people were saying and all of that stuff. And, in multiple languages, I might add. And so in Germany, yeah, I mean, Kempff was sort of a thing, but and I know that in the United States this was a thing, but this was the thing that you also saw talked about in places like, the Penguin Guide and other sources and France. And there was no question whatsoever that this was the deal for Beethoven piano concertos. And, part of the reason, I mean, Fleisher here was also, he was young, he was American, he wasn't what, people typically expected. He was in a Beethoven pianist, and for that reason there may have been some resistance in some quarters. But in general, people who were honest about musical excellence and who cared about the best performances had no doubts that this was a major, major accomplishment. It was probably in the first great Beethoven concerto cycle in terms of overall unity and quality through all 5 concertos. I mean, there's not a weak link anywhere. There's not a weak performance. There's not, I mean, because Szell wouldn't tolerate it. One of the things that we just have to sort of understand and accept is that there were certain artists who were fantastic because of the standards that they upheld. And Szell was first among them. He would only work with soloists who he felt were at the requisite level of achievement. I mean, people who he could work with meant people he could sort of push around sometimes too, and tell them how to do it. That was true part of the time as well. But it was a feature of Szell's art that he was never going to let a performance fall below a certain level of excellence, and particularly in Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, in the German standard repertoire. He simply couldn't do it at less than a very, very exalted level, and he found soloists who were of like mind. And Fleisher was a young genius. His career was tragic because he had focal dystonia and lost the use of his right hand for a while. Went on to become a very important teacher and was always a tremendous musician. So there was something fresh and wonderful about these performances when they came out, and those qualities have not dimmed over time. This is still the reference edition for Beethoven piano concertos. Now, however, I have to say, there have been some amazingly fabulous Beethoven piano concerto cycles in modern day, particularly issued in tandem with, period instrument strictures, not played on period instruments necessarily. But I mean, for example, there was the Bronfman-Zinman cycle, which is amazing. There's Martin Helmchen with Andromancy on alpha, which is fabulous. There's the recent Halcyon Zhang Philadelphia cycle, which is as great as any on bis. There's some incredible work being done these days in the Beethoven piano concertos, all of which I think, first of all, gives us reason to be very hopeful about the future of these works, but also that there are going to be performances that may become the new reference recordings. There may be. I mean, we'll have to see how many people hear them, how many people notice them, and how it all shakes down. What concerns me about it is that because there are so many recordings of these works now, and because there are so many new recordings of these works, I mean, in the past few years, there must have been a dozen Beethoven piano concerto cycles issued. And I can't even begin to emphasize the importance of the fact that when these came out, there weren't so many. It makes such a difference when there are fewer candidates, for the palm, as opposed to just dozens and dozens of things that don't get promoted and don't get marketed, or they're on smaller labels, or it makes it so much harder to determine what the reference recordings will be. But what I can say is that there is certainly no diminution of fabulousness in the performance and recording of Beethoven piano concertos. And I stress that's not just on the pianistic side. I'm also talking about in terms of the conducting, the orchestras, the interplay between soloist and orchestra, because these concertos require both. That's the problem with Kempf-Leitner. Kempf is fine. Leitner, okay, not terrible, not terribly interesting either. And Arau Galliera, I mean, Arau is great. Areas, Arau's cycle, frankly, is kind of like my favorite, but the one with Colin Davis. It's like his third Beethoven piano concerto cycle, right? Because there was a Phillips one with Haitink that came in the middle, I think, somewhere. But I think there are some individual performances there that are just unbelievable. And I saw some of them live, too, so that sort of helped them to sink into my consciousness. So, and we'll have to talk about individual performances where maybe we can extract something from some of those other cycles as reference recordings. Because I think there are a couple. I really do. But in terms of cycles, well, let the chips fall where they may. If you can't accept this because it's too American or because Szell's name comes up in this series too frequently, look, when we get outside the German repertoire, I guarantee you Szell's name isn't coming up at all. I mean, the basic German repertoire, a couple other things. I mean, if we want to do reference recordings for Walton's Partita, okay, we'll talk about Szell again. But basically, fundamentally, that's what we're doing first. We're doing the basic stuff first. And for that reason, we're talking about these great, great, great recordings from the halcyon days of LP in the late 50s and early 60s when our modern references were born. It was a historical moment, a very interesting historical moment. And, memories are long in the world of classical music in some respects. In some respects, they're non-existent. But yeah, and whether this still is the reference recording because it's still one of the best, well, it is still one of the best. There's no question about that. But because, people haven't bothered to listen to other things as frequently, or because no other consensus has coalesced around another set, well, those are things we can debate and we can talk about. But this is it, my friends. And if you haven't heard them, you need to, because they are outstanding performances, marvelous performances. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.